Mom sold my wedding dress for my sister's rehab. Then I found out she stole the groom, too. My mother sold my wedding dress without telling me. I found out 3 weeks before my wedding. Then I found something worse. My fiance's car parked outside her house at 2 a.m. My sister was in rehab. My mother wasn't alone. My name is Claire Whitfield. And I used to believe that the worst thing a person could lose was a thing. A dress, a deposit, a date circled on a calendar. I know better now. The worst thing you can lose is the version of yourself that still trusted people. Getting that back, if you get it back at all, takes a long time. Let me tell you how I lost it. The dress was my grandmother's. Not literally. It wasn't a vintage gown pulled from a cedar chest with mothballs and old perfume. But it had been bought with my grandmother's money. 3 weeks before she passed, she pressed an envelope into my hands at her kitchen table and said, "That's for your dress. I want you to have something beautiful." $11,000 in a cream envelope with my name written in her handwriting. I was 26. I wasn't even engaged yet. Daniel and I had been together 2 years, and the proposal was still 6 months away. But my grandmother knew. She always knew things slightly before they happened, like she was operating on a different timeline than the rest of us. She died on a Tuesday in November. Daniel proposed the following April. I bought the dress in June. Ivory silk, hand-sewn beading along the neckline. The kind of dress that makes you stand differently when you put it on. Straighter somehow. More certain. I had it altered twice over the following year. I had it stored at the bridal boutique until 4 months before the wedding, then brought it home and kept it in the garment bag in my childhood bedroom closet, because I was still living with my mother during the engagement, while Daniel and I saved for our apartment. It never occurred to me that it wasn't safe there. It was my mother's house. My sister Jess is 4 years older than me. I want to be careful about how I describe Jess, because she is not a bad person. Addiction is not a moral failing. I believe that. I've believed it through years of watching her struggle. But it does make people do things that hurt the people around them. Jess had been in and out of recovery for 6 years by the time of my engagement. Opioids initially, then whatever was available. My mother had spent a significant portion of her savings on Jess's treatment. 2 residential programs, multiple outpatient cycles, a sober living situation that lasted 8 months before it didn't. When Jess relapsed for the 4th time, 2 months before my wedding, the family crisis was immediate and total. My mother called me at work. She was crying. Jess had been found by a neighbor. The details were bad. The hospital was involved. I left work. I drove to the hospital. I sat in a waiting room for 4 hours. Jess survived. She needed residential treatment again, the kind that required payment up front, because her insurance had gaps and my mother had already exhausted certain avenues. I told my mother I would help however I could. I meant financially, within reason. I had some savings, not much. We were planning a wedding, but I would contribute what I could. What I did not say, what I did not mean, what I never in any version of any conversation consented to, was the dress. I found out on a Thursday. I'd gone to my childhood bedroom to check on something. I don't even remember what, something mundane. And I opened the closet. The garment bag was gone. I stood in front of that empty closet for a long time. Long enough that the light outside the window changed slightly. Then I went downstairs and asked my mother where the dress was. She was at the kitchen sink. She didn't turn around immediately. That delay, 2-3 seconds, told me everything before she said a word. She said, "Claire, sit down." I said, "Where is my dress?" She turned around. And she told me she had sold it. 3 weeks earlier, through a consignment bridal shop 2 towns over, she had sold my dress for $4,200, less than half what I'd paid, less than half what it was worth, and used the money as partial payment for Jess's residential program. She had not asked me. She had not told me. She had taken the dress from the closet, driven it to the shop, signed the paperwork, and deposited the money. While I was at work. While I was planning the wedding, she was supposed to be helping me plan. What followed was the kind of argument that doesn't feel like an argument. It feels like weather. Like something moving through you that you can't stop and can only survive. My mother cried. She said she hadn't known what else to do. She said she thought I could find another dress. She said Jess's life was more important than a piece of fabric. I want to address that last part directly, because I've heard it repeated by people who heard the story secondhand and took my mother's side. Jess's life was not more important to me than a piece of fabric. Jess's life was more important to me than almost anything, but that was not the choice my mother had made. The choice my mother had made was to take something that was not hers, something bought with a dead woman's money, something tied to grief and love and the last conversation I ever had with my grandmother, and sell it without asking. She could have asked. That's the part I couldn't get past. She could have come to me and said, "Claire, I'm desperate. I need help. Is there any way?" And I would have said yes. I don't know for certain, but I believe I would have said yes. She didn't give me the chance to be the person who said yes. She just took. I told Daniel that night. He was at his apartment. We still had separate places, still saving, still 31 days from the wedding. And I drove over and sat on his couch and told him everything. He held me while I cried. He said, "We'll find another dress. It won't be the same, I know, but we'll find something." He said the right things. He touched my hair. He made me tea. I drove home at midnight, thinking that at least I had him, that the dress was gone and Jess was in a facility and my relationship with my mother was fractured in ways I couldn't yet measure, but that I had Daniel, that in 31 days I was going to marry him. That thought got me through the drive home. I want to remember that thought kindly, even now, even knowing what I know, because it was the last uncomplicated thing I had for a while. 17 days before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. I'd been sleeping badly for weeks, between the dress and Jess and the wedding logistics that had become increasingly fraught. Waking at 2 a.m. had become a kind of routine. I'd make tea, check emails, sometimes drive. That night, I drove. No destination, just the particular comfort of motion when the mind won't stop. I drove out of my neighborhood, down the main road, through the part of town where the gas stations and late-night diners sat under orange lights. And then I turned onto my mother's street. I don't know why. Habit, maybe. I'd turned onto that street 10,000 times in my life. Daniel's car was in the driveway, a silver Honda Civic with a dent on the rear bumper from when he'd backed into a parking structure in February. His car. Unmistakably. At 2:17 a.m. With the downstairs lights on. I want to describe the specific quality of that moment, because I think it matters that you understand it wasn't instant. It wasn't a lightning bolt of comprehension. It was a slow, cold unwinding. Like watching a knot you've been staring at for a long time finally reveal that it was never the shape you thought it was. I sat in my car across the street. I sat there for 20 minutes. Then I drove home. I didn't sleep. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call my mother. I sat on my couch until it was light outside, and I thought about all the times my mother had asked about Daniel. How she'd always asked just slightly too much. Not like a mother-in-law gathering information, but like something else. Something more interested. How Daniel had, in retrospect, always been slightly more comfortable in her presence than seemed entirely natural. How they had, at my cousin's birthday party in March, stood talking in the kitchen for 40 minutes while I was outside with the kids. How he'd offered 3 weeks ago to help her with something at the house. I couldn't remember what. And I'd thought nothing of it. How I'd thought nothing of any of it. Because you don't. You don't think anything of it until you're sitting in your car at 2 a.m. looking at his car in her driveway. And then you think of everything. I didn't confront either of them immediately. This surprises people when I tell the story. They expect rage, immediate, volcanic, righteous. And the rage was there. It was absolutely there. But I'd learned from years of Jess's crises, from years of being the daughter who held things together, from years of being the one who didn't fall apart because someone had to not fall apart. I'd learned to be deliberate. So I waited 2 days. I gathered what I needed. I checked Daniel's location history on the shared Google Maps account we'd set up when we got engaged. For practical reasons, for coordinating pickups and drop-offs, for the ordinary logistics of 2 people building a life together. The history told a story. My mother's address appeared 11 times in the past 4 months. On days when I had been at work. On evenings when he'd told me he was with friends. On a Saturday afternoon when he'd said he was at his brother's. 11 times. 4 months. I called Jess. I know that might seem strange. Jess was in a residential facility, limited phone access, in the early fragile weeks of a new attempt at recovery. But Jess was my sister. And Jess, whatever she had put me through over the years, loved me in the specific way that older siblings love younger ones. Fiercely, guiltily, with a protectiveness that addiction had buried but not destroyed. I told her what I'd found. The silence on her end lasted a long time. Then she said, "I didn't know about him. I swear to you, Claire, I didn't know." I believed her. Then she said, "But I knew about Mom." I closed my eyes. "What do you mean?" She told me. She told me that 6 months ago, before her relapse, during one of her clearer periods, she had noticed something. Messages on my mother's phone, seen accidentally. She hadn't known what to do with it. She'd been fragile. She'd told herself it wasn't what it looked like. She'd told herself she was wrong. She'd said nothing. I didn't blame her for that. I don't blame her now. But I held the phone very tightly for the rest of that conversation. I confronted them separately. Daniel first. I asked him to come over. I made coffee. I let him sit down. I let him ask how I was doing. I let him say something about final wedding details. Then I put my phone on the table between us with the location history open. I watched his face. There is a particular expression that people make when they are caught completely. When there is no story, no explanation, no version of reality in which the evidence in front of them can be reframed. It's not exactly guilt. It's more like the sudden absence of performance. The face underneath the face. I saw that expression. He tried. He said it wasn't what I thought. He said they were friends. He said my mother had been going through a hard time. I let him talk. When he was done, I told him the wedding was off. I told him to leave. He left. My mother was harder. Not because I loved her more, though I do or did, or some version of that love still exists somewhere under everything that happened. Harder because she didn't have the decency to look caught. She looked, somehow, like she had been waiting for this conversation and had prepared for it. She said she was sorry. She said things had happened and she hadn't meant for them to. She said Daniel had come to her for advice, about me, about the wedding, about feeling unsure, and that it had developed from there. She said, "You have to understand, Claire, I was lonely." I have thought about that sentence many times since. I was lonely. I don't doubt it. My parents divorced when I was 14. My mother had been alone for 9 years. Jess's illness had consumed the last 6 of those years in a specific kind of exhausting grief. I don't doubt the loneliness. But I stood in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd told me about the dress, the same kitchen where I'd eaten breakfast for 18 years. And I said, "You were lonely, so you took my grandmother's money, and then you took my fiancé." She didn't answer. I left. I canceled the wedding. The venue deposit was lost. The catering deposit was lost. The flowers, the photographer, the band. Some were refunded partially, some weren't. I found a small apartment. I moved out of my mother's house. I went back to work. I did the ordinary things that you do when the life you were building has to be rebuilt from scratch. Laundry, grocery shopping, answering emails, showing up. The dress I never got back. The consignment shop had already sold it to someone else by the time I thought to try. I hope whoever bought it was happy in it. I hope she danced. Jess got out of the residential program 4 months later. She called me on the day she was discharged. She said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm going to be better." I said, "I know that too." We had dinner that week, just the two of us, a diner near her new sober living house, bad coffee and good pie. We talked for 3 hours, about her recovery, about my apartment, about our grandmother, about all the ordinary things that sisters talk about when they're finding their way back to each other. She reached across the table at one point and said, "You deserved better," from all of us. I didn't argue, but I reached back. My mother and I don't speak regularly. We have reached something I would describe as a cautious, structured detente, the kind of relationship that works only with distance and limited exposure. Holidays are negotiated in advance. Certain topics are off limits. It's not what I wanted, but it's what's possible. Daniel, I have nothing to say about Daniel. That chapter is closed in the specific way that you close a chapter when you realize the person you were grieving was never quite real. The man I fell in love with and the man I found out existed were not the same person. Letting go of the first one was hard. Letting go of the second one was easy. I got engaged again. I'm not ready to tell that part of the story yet. It's still too new, still too tender, still something I hold carefully the way you hold something you're afraid to drop. But I'll say this. When I found the new dress, not my grandmother's money this time, my own money, earned slowly and kept safely, I brought it home and hung it in my own closet, in my own apartment, with a lock on the door that only I have the key to. Small thing, but mine. People sometimes ask me what the lesson is, what I'd tell someone going through something like this. Here's what I'd say. Grief is not linear. Loss is not always the thing you can see. The dress was a symbol, and symbols matter, not because they're just things, but because of what they carry. My grandmother's handwriting on an envelope, the last thing she gave me before she left. That's not nothing. Neither is trust, and neither is the moment you realize, on the other side of all of it, that you are still here, still capable of love, still capable of a closet with a dress in it, and a door with a lock, and a future you're building for yourself, with your own hands, on your own terms. My name is Claire Whitfield, and I am still here. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to know they're not alone. Subscribe for new stories every day. See you next time.